Good morning. My name is Arisa Elamine, and I would like to welcome you to the Economic Equity Closing the Gender and Pay Gap breakout panel discussion. We have two panelists that I will introduce to you shortly, but I would really like to say welcome. And I think it's so wonderful during Women's History Month that we are connecting and celebrating as women. As I said, my name is Arisa Elamine, and I'm the CEO of Arisa Elamine Consulting. I'm a leadership consultant and coach, and I believe in the power of connection and diversity. And so, what I will say is, while I see that we have more people joining this breakout session, I would encourage you and encourage us all to connect with women, because we know the importance of the power of connection. So with myself, with the panelists, and throughout this summit, make sure that you connect with us on LinkedIn. You can reach me through arisaelamineconsulting.com or arisaelamine@yahoo.com. I think we need to continue to have these conversations about women in leadership and also women and economic, hopefully, prosperity. Today we'll be talking about the pay gap. And so let's continue the conversation. I am the moderator for today, and I can't wait for you to hear from our panelists. We have Cynthia Bush, who is with UNC Charlotte, and she is going to come and share with us information about the finance part and also just the chasm that we have in terms of the pay gap. And then we have Kirsten Sickley, who is the CEO of the YMCA, and I think it's going to be an important dialogue. So I'm going to ask them to open with a few remarks, and then we'll get into questions. And this is interactive. So I will say we have a chat, and so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We want this to be a lively discussion about some important issues. So with that, I will pass it on to Cynthia and Kirsten.
Well, I guess I'll go first. And welcome, everyone. It's great to have so many people here to participate in our discussion today. So my name is Cynthia Bush, and as Arisa just mentioned, I am on the finance faculty at UNCC. I've been here for slightly less than 5 years. Prior to that, I was in corporate America, working in the world of investments, primarily for corporations. So that's my background. These days, and even before I joined the university, I spent a lot of time with people in the community, helping women and men work through challenges related to financial literacy, as well as their own personal situations. And what I find dovetails very nicely into what we're talking about today. So let's just dive in a little bit in terms of, well, what are we talking about today? So the gender gap is really talking about the difference in the earnings power between women and men. And we're really going to today focus on the United States, but this is something that is prevalent throughout the developed world. And there's a lot of research out there stretching back a number of decades. And there's differences in opinion about how the gap should be calculated. But one thing is clear: women consistently make less than men, and that difference varies widely. It is wider for women of color versus others, but it is there. And in fact, since the second half of the 20th century, women's participation in the workforce has increased significantly. Women are working longer. Women are attaining higher levels of education. And yet, despite that, this difference in pay between men and women is still large. And in fact, within the last decade has barely budged. So today we're really going to talk more about, well, why is this? And more importantly, what can be done about it? But I do want to say one thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. So our session today, I think is a little bit misnamed. And Kristen and Arisa and I were talking about this earlier. Because when I think of the word gap, it really reminds me of something that I heard in London when I used to work there years ago. So I'd be at the tube station, which is their word for train, and I'm waiting for the train to come into the station. And you'd hear this mechanical voice over and over and over saying, mind the gap. And the gap that the voice was referring to was about the 5 inches or so between the platform where we were standing and the train to step onto the train. So you had to just cross these 5 inches to get onto the train. And it kept saying, mind the gap, mind the gap. So today, when we're talking about differences in terms of wage attainment between men and women, it's not a gap. It's not a 5-inch difference. It's actually a chasm. And instead, to me, it's more akin to the Grand Canyon. That's really what we're talking about. The Grand Canyon at its widest point is about 20 miles wide. The gap that has been persistent through the decades is about 20 cents. But those 20 cents, when compounded over 40 years of working, can reach almost $1 million, particularly for Latino women, and about $500,000 for women in general, in terms of the difference in earning power between men and women. So I want to frame that to just say, so we're talking about something very significant, more significant than a gap. It's more significant than a few cents. And this is something that impacts women's lives and our society. So let me get off my high horse and let me turn it over to Kirsten.
Cynthia, that was beautifully put. And just let me say, it's an honor to be with you all today, to be with our moderator, Arisa, and with our co-panelist, Cynthia. I loved the mind the gap image. I thought of that a lot too when we were in Europe. And I think that we often don't think about it in terms of the longevity and the compounded problems that pay inequity creates. It doesn't stop with the paycheck. It influences how your Social Security payout winds up being because you're making less. It influences what you can put into a retirement account. And if you're fortunate enough to have an employer that will match at any percentage what you're able to contribute, you're leaving money on the table because you can't put enough in. So I'm honored to be with you all today. I'm Kirsten Sickley. I have had the privilege of growing up in the YWCA, and the YWCA's mission nationally is around eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all people. And the intersectionality of that mission really centers women and girls of color. And we have seen that while, as to Cynthia's point, women were able to really be able to make entry into the workforce, that has changed. For the past several decades, women in the workforce had really evened out with men. And then came the recession of 2009, and predominantly male-dominated jobs were hurt in that era, and women began to even out. But now we've seen female unemployment reach double digits for the first time since 1948. White women haven't been such a small share of the population with a job since the late 1970s. And women of color, who are more likely to be the sole breadwinners and are often lower income workers, are suffering acutely. So it is a privilege to be with you all today to talk about this, and thank you for having us.
Thank you both. You know, as we talk about recovery and discovery and the impact of the dual pandemic, we know from statistics and from the research that COVID-19 could impact years and erase years of progress that women have made. And in talking about these issues, I'd like to get to my first question for you both to respond to, and that is, before COVID-19, you know, with the Me Too movement, racism, sexism, and financial instability, you know, it was already a reality for so many women. So how has the cumulative impact of these pandemics affected women in the workplace, in corporate America, in the nonprofit sector, and also many of our first frontline workers?
Okay, I guess I'll start off. So, and we probably should start off with some numbers. In mid-January, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released their final jobs report for 2020. And in that report, based on some analysis that the National Women's Law Center did, they determined that women had lost 156,000 jobs in the month of December,
Wow.
while men had gained a net of about 16,000 jobs. So in other words, in the month of December of 2020, women accounted for 100% of the labor market's job losses. 100%.
That's a startling statistic.
Yeah, it's like crazy. And not only that, but also apparently according to the same report, the long-term unemployment for women, particularly since the start of the pandemic, is startling. Almost 40% of the women who are unemployed have been out of work for at least 6 months or longer. So it's not just that they're losing the jobs, it's also that they haven't been able to find replacement income. And then you have a number of women, over 2 million of them, who have dropped out of the workforce altogether and stopped looking for work. So it's a she session, as people have said, it's definitely that. And the pandemic has exacerbated that because it has, unlike 2008, as Kristen referenced, it has really hit hard on occupations that are predominantly staffed by women. And so we see that in these numbers. So in terms of the coronavirus's long-term impact on women, it's early, but we now have women who are behind in terms of having employment, who are not making a living wage, many of them on top of that. Also seeing health challenges, couple that with childcare issues and elder care issues. And the picture is bleak, certainly bleaker than it was at the start of the pandemic, and it still wasn't good then. But let me let Kirsten also comment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting and different for women who have more income. We are seeing 1 in 4 women do things that we would have thought unthinkable just a couple of years ago, which is to choose to leave the workforce. And that is really causing a backslide. And then we have women who are the sole breadwinners and are oftentimes in a lower wage position who cannot make that decision, who are making very challenging decisions about trying to balance childcare while working. Many women are in lower wage jobs, not in a place where they can take their Zoom calls from home. They are frontline workers. They are more impacted by the risks of COVID. So when we think about women leaving the labor force, we're not just losing the economic output, but we're losing the way that women contribute. As Arissa talked about, when we connect, something very special happens. Women bring a lot to the workforce that is unique with a female perspective. And as that sort of vacuum is created with women leaving, it will impact how the workforce works. I think the best employers are looking at how they can possibly be more flexible with women and men too, but how they can support this dual role that women oftentimes have of not only working, but then having the quote second shift of childcare and oftentimes elder care, and certainly maintaining and running a household. After the day is done at the workplace, whether you're working from home or going into a workspace, you still are taking care of all of those things. And so I think, to Cynthia's point, there is a trauma that we hear women across the spectrum and across jobs articulating And the weight that they are feeling and the stress that they are feeling is compounding. And I don't know that we will even know the impact of that until we are to a place where, with the vaccinations, we feel like we can breathe. And I think we're going to be doing a lot of healing and supporting to help working women and girls get through this.
What you're sharing is really, it takes me back to almost 10 years ago when I was on a panel for the Women's Summit back in 2012, and we were talking about the pay gap. And so it's amazing that we continue to have this conversation when we know that women make up, or, prior to the statistics that you shared, made up almost 50% of the workplace. And so, we know that organizations will be impacted. We know that the community is impacted, and we know that families are impacted. Can we talk a little bit more about what you see as the impact to the economy by having women and girls, women in particular, working women, or those who are not able to get back into the workplace? What do you think the impact to our economy and our community will be?
Gosh, well, Cynthia mentioned just what had been reported in January, but when we look at the beginning of the pandemic for the United States in March 2020, which feels like yesterday, but was an entire year ago, women in all parts of the economy lost 5.3 million jobs, as compared to men who lost 4.6 million. That is an enormous amount of earning power, whether you're a high wage earner or a lower wage earner, that you then cannot turn around and spend in the economy. So I don't know the analysis of what that damage would be to an economy, but just those powerful statistics about women who have lost jobs over the past year clearly signals a concern for the economy overall.
And I would definitely echo Kirsten's comments on that point. And what's interesting is that, some of the measures to fix some of these issues, we've made great strides on. So there was a lot of discussion, decades ago about more women needed to be in the workforce in order to increase the ability of their households to survive and boost the household income. Well, the participation of women in the labor force has grown significantly since the 1960s. And then there was discussion about women need to get more schooling in order to be eligible for some of the higher paying jobs. Well, women have made great strides in educational attainment. And in fact, according to some studies, it's actually now more women are getting higher degrees than men. So that's already been achieved. Not to say there isn't further to go there. And yet we're sitting here today, as Arissa just pointed out and Kirsten just pointed out, talking about something that has been persistent for decades. And so when we talk about the impact on the economy, clearly we are looking at a segment of our population, females, who are not going to be able to contribute in terms of earning power, in terms of their total capacity. And this is also weighing on their mental health on top of all of that. So these are issues that I think we need to put a sense of urgency behind to address, because they've lagged far too long.
And to piggyback on what Cynthia said, the world in which I operate for the most part is the nonprofit sector. So I think this is a powerful statistic to consider. Women in the nonprofit sector, women CEOs in the nonprofit sector, earn 75% of what men do. And that was just documented in January in a report in the Chronicle of Philanthropy based on informational tax returns of over 100,000 CEOs, women CEOs. That's just one sector. When you look at the higher education sector, when you look at the governmental sector, when you look at the for-profit sector, when you look at the faith community sector, there's lots of ways where you can see inequity play out. But just in the nonprofit sector, I think 3/4 of what men earn is a powerful image. So it's both, have we stepped into the workforce and stepped into the opportunity to gain higher educational attainment? Yes, we have. But has that eliminated the gap? No, it has not.
Mhm. And Kirsten, you also bring up something very powerful, because early days of the research suggested that it was because women tended to be in occupations that were lower paid.
Right.
And so therefore, that's why we had this called a chasm, but they call it a gap, right? But even within the same occupation at the same level, as you so eloquently stated, there's still a significant difference. And when you compound that difference across a 40-year working period, those dollars add up.
They certainly do. And as you mentioned that, I think about a lot of initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly as, organizations, companies, and the community reckons with the, the not only the pandemic, but the other pandemics that we alluded to, the, racism and financial instability and things like that. So, as organizations, look to improve their connection with people across the spectrum from different backgrounds. Could you speak more about what you have heard or what your hopes are as far as organizations really embracing the equity part and the inclusion part of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
As an organization whose mission leads with the elimination of racism, I can say just anecdotally that in the summer, we began to see a lot of outreach from corporations that we had not necessarily heard from before about how they might be able to provide more education and more opportunity for their employees to learn more and be stronger advocates in terms of equity and diversity and inclusion. And of course, our hope is that that is not a flash in the pan, that will hold. I do sense a groundswell, if you will, of more people who look like me, being willing to learn how to be better allies, being willing to learn more about our history as a country, and the fact that is not history, it's currency, it's the present, and how we dismantle whiteness. And so I think, that is just a multi-layered, very complex issue as it relates to not just job parity and pay equity, but, housing equity and healthcare equity, all kinds of things. So, I to your point, Arisa, I think we all have a lot of work to do within our own organizations, and it is important to do the work of looking at, what are we doing that is best practice? Are we asking for salary histories? And are we then pigeonholing people, women, based on what their past salary is? Or are we using a best practice of posting an actual job range compensation? Are we making sure that on our boards and on our leadership teams that we have a not just diverse staff, but an included and an inclusive staff? So those are just some of my thoughts about where we are. And again, I'm very hopeful that it is sustained and not just flash in the pan.
And I think, to piggyback off of your comments, Kirsten, that I think each one of us can take ownership on trying to make sure it is sustained and not let this drop. And you're right, we have had, at least I've seen anecdotally, more energy, activity, and research around some of these issues, which is fantastic, particularly given the events of last summer. And as you pointed out, Arisa, some of it is basically packaged together. But we also are talking about trying to change a mindset within our own society. And that's hard. We just have to just say that is going to be hard. And I give some anecdotes. So for example, someone that I'm working with, very, very bright, very sharp, and in terms of a career choice, was focused on becoming an assistant in the medical field. And so, having conversations with this person, younger person, and like, well, have you thought about, maybe you don't, if you want to be the assistant, that's fine, but there's also other things you can be where you're not the assistant, but you're the boss. Are you interested in that? And she said, I never thought about it. My family just told me, this is probably the best thing for you. And so this is what I've been trying to go out and do. I never thought about trying to do anything else, and certainly never aspired to anything higher than that. And so I think sometimes, I know that there are external pressures and everything about, where women end up and why we have this difference in pay. Sometimes it's the choices that women make, which are colored by the people, the mentors, the family, and society around them. So to now take all of that back to Arissa's initial question, yes, I think anecdotally we're seeing lots of activity around this, but I also think we need to not be surprised if it's a little bit of slow going and in fits and starts, because what we're trying to do is not just change this wage gap thing. We're actually trying to change minds, and we're trying to change society. And that is going to be hard work.
Amen. And I think we are seeing that in how we approach, even teaching our students within the YWCA's youth learning centers. You cannot be what you don't see. So to the point of your young woman mentee who wanted to pursue medical assistant opportunities, why not more? And so seeing yourselves reflected in literature, seeing your opportunities reflected in people in your network, sponsors in your network, that's an important role that everyone can play. I think it's like you can't unsee it. So when you really think about social capital, we talk about that a lot in terms of economic mobility. I am so keenly aware of who picks up the phone and calls me to ask about connecting a niece or a student with an opportunity. If we didn't push a little harder, most of those networking options would happen without thought, but they would primarily be people who identify as white. Mm-hmm. So you really have to kind of push on that to, create that social capital opportunity that extends to a much more diverse group of eligible, wonderful, talented people. Mm-hmm. And that takes, as you said, Cynthia, all of us thinking, being self-aware on that front, and recognizing that, for example, we are very intentional about making sure that our board at YWCA reflects our community, and that we have fantastic, amazing women. They're all women, by the way, but women of color on our board, leading our board. If I had a dime for every time someone suggested a white woman to our board, I'd have a lot of dimes. And that doesn't mean that there aren't wonderful women who are white who are candidates for those leadership roles. But it is insidious that is what happens first and foremost over and over and over. So I think it's baked into not just pay, as you said, but opportunities for leadership, for growth, for education, for mentors. And it's endemic, and it takes our monitoring ourselves at all times.
I think it's really important that you all touched on not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the power of mentorship and networking. And, it makes me think about one of my other questions. We talk about women and girls, and I really think about the girls. Think about the girls who may hear about these statistics. And so as we talk about issues, I also like for us to think about, potential solutions and information that you would share with your younger self or a mentee or someone just entering a professional environment or, a frontline worker? What can we say to them, or what information do you think will help encourage them to, despite the statistics, to keep pressing on and reaching higher and expanding so that we can be present and do on our side what we can do to reach for equity in the workplace, in business, and in our community?
One thing I think that is often overlooked, and young people can be part of this as well, is how they are taught and cultivated to use their civic voices for issues that matter to them. And even as a nonprofit, we are fully allowed to advocate for legislative priorities. So why wouldn't we help some of our young women learn about legislative priorities that we might work on as a coalition? For example, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which is right now has been reintroduced into the House of Representatives, HR 7. It is a bipartisan piece of legislation, which is so exciting. And it addresses things like not asking for salary histories and having pay data transparency. And how powerful would it be to have a group of girls in Girl Scouts or a middle school civic group at their school who does service projects together? Think about learning about legislation that impacts positively or could impact positively women and girls, and become engaged in that and write to their elected officials. I think we often think that that's something over there that other people can do. We can all do that. And we can, politics is personal. We can do that at the local level where it's really very important. We can be talking about advocating for increased affordable housing, because we need that for people who are earning lower wages. And it's sort of a snowball effect in a positive way. Once you begin to feel comfortable using your civic voice and you have researched a topic that matters to you and you have something to say about it and you have a personal story to tell, watch out. That is an empowered young woman. And I think that's one way we can really help to dispel the negative messages that can be coming her way that we don't want her to internalize.
And Kirsten gave a very powerful example of how women and girls can be very impactful from a macro perspective with legislation, which is so important. We can also look at it from a micro perspective and how we need to make sure that our young girls have the confidence in themselves and their abilities to ask and demand what they're due. And so an example of that would be, there's tons of research out there, and I believe we're going to put some of this research on the website, that, when young girls are graduating from high school or college and getting that first job, they don't want to negotiate the salary, right? They tend to, or if they negotiate, they don't negotiate as well as their male peers. And so that's the beginning of the wage difference, right? From age 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever it is, if you accept a salary, and even if it's an hourly job, and you accept a salary that's $1 or $1.50 less over your working career, it is very challenging to make that up. So we need to make sure that our girls and our young ladies feel very comfortable in who they are and their abilities, so that they can go out and demand their due and not be ashamed about negotiating, not being ashamed about asking for a raise, not being ashamed about seeking a promotion, not being uncomfortable about those things, but doing them in a way that's respectful, but also translates into, I know who I am and I know my worth, and helping others see that they should be paid and have opportunities that are commensurate with their worth. I heard a wonderful story from a professor a couple of years ago, and she was talking about grad students and how the female grad students were complaining that they hadn't received what were viewed as very plum assignments versus their male peers. And so this got escalated, and the person who was making the decision said, I didn't know that these females wanted these roles. The male graduate assistants came marching into my office one by one and practically pounded their fists on the table and said, we want these roles, we want these roles.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard from the women. I assumed they didn't want them. They weren't interested. Meanwhile, when you talk to the female grad students, they said, oh, we were waiting to be asked.
Interesting.
So it's kind of those nuances that can lead to big difference economically and socially. And my sister's a professor in Texas, Dr. Parks, and she's done a lot of work on social capital, which both of you mentioned as well. And it's a challenging topic because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so this idea that it's very important to network and grow your network, and what's the appropriate way to use your network to empower yourself and your family, is something that for a lot of people that's unfamiliar. And trying to get them in that world so that they can make micro differences in their lives, which then leads to macro improvement, is a challenge. But those are things I think that we can focus on, trying to empower young girls to make a difference for themselves, speak up for themselves.
And we're much more likely, to Cynthia's point, to be able to do that if we have a network of people around us who are encouraging us to do so and who are saying, you can do it. I remember being powerfully struck several years ago reading Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. She talked about how, and I don't remember the actual statistics, but how if there was a job opportunity for a promotion and a man felt as if he could do 50% of it, he would throw his hat in the ring and go for that job. And a woman would look at the same job and she was qualified to do 85% of it. And since she didn't feel like she could do all of it, she sometimes shied away from going for the job. Some of that is how we've conditioned our boys and our girls, but we can help with reconditioning so that we are encouraging our young women and girls to go for the next step and then be there to support them in enhancing the skills that they still want to develop or need to develop for that particular job.
We have a question and comment in the chat. I believe this is from Midori, and it says, I totally agree. Not only are women not taught how to negotiate their salaries, but it's frowned upon in most corporate cultures to speak up about her salary. How do we change this narrative?
I love the question from Midori, and it's going to take me back to talking about legislation. The House Bill number 7, the Paycheck Fairness Act, is taking steps to update the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And some of the elements of that, challenging discrimination and empowering employers, is not only about, not asking for salary history to set wages, but one of the elements is to prevent employers from retaliating against workers who discuss or disclose their wages. I've read story after story, I know all of you have too, of women who, without even looking, somehow came across information that let them know about a male colleague doing the very same job, making $20,000 more. In the current environment that Midori is speaking to, it is at least frowned upon, and in some cases, it is punitively treated for you to discuss salary and compare. And this, working towards the Paycheck Fairness Act, would remove that. I can't think of the right word for it, but it would remove that barrier.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also have the societal barrier, right? Mm-hmm. So when a woman speaks up, there's lots of labels that can be placed on her, right? And some of them are aggressive, and some of the words used are witch, and some of the words used are words that we're not going to repeat in this session.
Or rhyme with witch.
Yeah, there you go. But and so that's one of the challenges, right? Women walk a very fine line. You're trying to make sure that you are confident in your abilities and you convey that in a way so that others have confidence in your abilities and you get what your worth is. But you've got to be careful not to be too demanding or too aggressive, because then that backfires and you're essentially blackballed. And so that's really a societal reaction. So what do we do to change that? I think Midori's question is absolutely spot on. Some of it is going to take legislation, but some of it's going to take changing minds and changing, even how do we bring our kids up?
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with women leaders and in coaching women around worth and assertiveness and conflict resolution, because these are the many things that people call soft skills, but effectively communicating your abilities and your desire for promotion. These are things that are really important, and that we have to continue to train and share information with the girls, teenagers, young college students, and those who are new to the workforce or who are starting businesses, to really understand their worth and communicate their worth. We have another question by in the chat from Janaka Lewis. How much is conditioning, and how much is it that many systems actually benefit from exclusion of women, so that we are more likely to get pushback or rejection from competing positions or pay?
Well, there's no question, right? There's a famous quote that those in power want to remain in power, right? And so there's no question that some of the things that we're talking about are going to result in certain segments of the population viewing that they would end up with less. And I think that's the pushback that Janica is talking about, right? If you're all of a sudden going to be paying portions of your workforce more based on their worth and their value, does that then mean it's a zero-sum game and other people, potentially white males, get less? And my argument is, if you end up paying women with their worth so that they are excited and happy and pleased to come into the workforce, they are energized with new ideas, I think at the end of the day, you actually make the whole pie bigger. We shouldn't look at ourselves as fighting over scraps of pie, right? Let's just make the pie bigger and then everybody can benefit. And I think that's really the way we have to look at it. But it's a great question, Janica.
I agree. I love the pie image, and I think it's important that we don't approach anything with a scarcity mindset. I think it applies to racial equity too. Does creating equity mean that the pie gets smaller for the people who have been in the dominant caste, if you will? I think women can actually, I'm thinking in my own personal experience with an all-female board, when I had the opportunity to compete for this position, it was right when the recession had hit and my predecessor left to go to United Way. And I have not shared this story publicly, but I was lowballed in the salary negotiation. So I look at Renee Bradford's question, what's the first thing a woman should do if she's considering speaking up to close her wage gap? I kind of had a feeling that that might happen because of the time we were in, with everybody being worried about the recession of 2008, 2009. And so it was really important, and I would say this to any woman if they're going to speak up to talk about negotiating their salary, to have salary surveys that are relevant to your position at hand. In that case, it might be local, similar nonprofits, in my case, with similar sized budgets and similar sized programs, or looking at YWCAs in similar markets around the country, and also doing some checking with colleagues who are in similar positions, so that it's not as much of a personal argument about demanding for yourself. it's really trying to depersonalize it for the person who will make that decision about what ultimately you'll be paid by sharing with them factual data. And again, with the Paycheck Fairness Act, I think that that transparency of having pay data readily available and a way for organizations to track it, which they don't always currently do, will be very valuable and should be widely shared. But that's what I would say for if you're going in to talk about, and the good news was ultimately they wanted me, so that worked. But I think I've had those conversations with many of my female colleagues who are peers at nonprofits over the years. And it is amazing how we can be our own worst enemy because we know how the organization's struggling, or we know that the budget won't bear it. Well, if we don't, I had a mentor one time say, you're doing this for your family and your salary will build from here. So don't lowball yourself.
Mhm.
And I think that's really an important mentality and mindset to take into that kind of negotiation.
And the other thing I would say about that is once you have the data, also have in the back of your mind the fallback plan.
Yeah.
Because every time you ask for a salary increase or a raise, you may be told no. And so you need to know in advance, what is your next step?
And Cynthia, in my situation, I had to be ready to leave the YWCA, where I had been for 15 years. And I had to know that I was ready to do that and go to a different nonprofit if I was going to have to settle. And that was a very hard decision, but I went into that knowing that. And that helped me in the conversation. And it wasn't a threat. I didn't even mention that in the conversation. I just knew in my heart that I had to be ready to go.
Well, and that's what's so important about, preparing and, knowing your worth, preparing for that discussion, and, teaching and practicing negotiating skills, not being afraid to, ask for what you want. And it's so much easier when you've done that research. So it's not just, I feel for what's going on with the organization, so I'm going to lowball it. I have data, and also I have skills to bring to the table that will impact the organization. And I think that is really key. We have another comment and question from Midori. This discussion has been so enlightening for me as I'm currently in graduate school for my MBA with a focus on HR leadership. My focus is retention, and my experience has allowed me to see employees lose their positions due to traumatic issues that were triggered while in the workplace, mostly women. What would you suggest that would help bridge this gap?
Well, Midori, I guess I can take this one because that's partially my story. So I ended up having to make a significant change in my career due to elder care issues. And it was something that was a heartbreaking decision for me personally, but I felt that I needed to put family first. But by making that decision, I knew that I was going to end up derailing myself from a career perspective. And if you're on that train, barreling down the track, reaching into the higher echelons of a career, and you purposely get off the train, it is very hard to get back on. But sometimes in life, things happen where you have to step off the train. And so then the question is, well, what do you do next? Right? And how do you keep your sanity? And how do you take care of your family and yourself and make sure that your career is what you want it to be? And there's lots of research out there about this. Is one of the key issues, just to circle all the way back to this, I hate to use the word gap, but the economic wage gap is, as you guys are probably well aware, for women, this is one of our number one issues. Even if we start out with the same pay, which we normally don't, but even if we do, because of the fact that we have career interruptions, whether they're our own health, a loved one's health, child care issues, elder care issues, some combination of all of those things, we end up having career derailments. And when we have career derailments, not only does it derail the progress of our career, it derails the progress of our income. And so from that, when you then try to, handle those challenges and then get back and try to regain what you lost, you can't catch that train. and so that's what leads to the gap over a 40-year career of about $500,000 for women on average, slightly more for women of color, slightly less for white women. So anyway, but to answer your question, now that I've gone on to all of that, congratulations to you for getting your MBA, number one, and retention is a huge issue in the corporate world. I think we do a decent job getting women, people of color, and other diverse populations into a lot of the workforce. It's not always at the right pay level, but at least we can get them in, which is something we couldn't have said 50 years ago. But the challenge is getting them to rise above a mid-level manager level. There's a reason that you only see, 2 or 3 Black women who are CEOs today, Fortune 500, I think it's 2. Very few Latinos, et cetera. So it's the elevation that's the challenge. And I think now, for our earlier conversation, there's been a more willingness to talk about that. Let's look at the statistics. Let's figure out why that is. And some of it is due to a lack of social capital. In order to progress in a career and in terms of wages, a lot of times we used to call them godfathers and godmothers. You need people within the organization, not necessarily at a higher level, but somewhere within the organization. You need people of influence who are willing to assist you in navigating the landmines and rising to the top. So it's a multifaceted issue, but certainly one that I have personally experienced, and it can be a real challenge.
Well, and it makes me think of mentoring. It makes me think of sponsorship in organizations, and whether it's someone who is working, hourly or someone who is salaried, I think the power of that social capital, the power of networking, will be so beneficial, because often, particularly as you rise through organizations, women may feel alone. They may start out with, some friends and connection, but as they rise through the organization, maybe they feel like, I can't stay connected. I have to keep my concerns or my worries or my experiences to myself, because if I share them, they'll judge me as a leader. But what I know, having worked in a variety of HR related roles and with diversity and inclusion, is the power of connection, the power of networking, and the power of mentorship. And I think, as organizations like Girl Scouts, as the YWCA, as programs like the Women's Summit, continue to connect women. And that's why I started out this session talking about the importance of networking. As these organizations support our young girls and women, I think that building that social capital will help us be more brave, to help us build up our sense of worth and our esteem, so that we can grow and challenge that glass ceiling and challenge the wage gaps. Any other suggestions that you all have as we move forward, potential solutions for addressing the economic disparity, the pay gap, and also just the strength of women in the workplace?
Well, I do want to go back to one point you just made, Arissa, and that is the whole concept of mentoring versus sponsorship. And for the type of attainment that we're talking about, someone really needs both, and they're not the same thing.
Right.
And I want to make sure that our audience really understands that you don't need someone to look like you in order for them to be a great mentor or a great sponsor. And I've been very blessed in my careers, as well as in my personal life, to have some wonderful friends who happen to be white males who took an interest in me and my career and were willing to, help me avoid the landmines that we had discussed earlier. So I want to give a shout out to the males, because they have a role to be played here as well. Yes, we want women to help other women. That's fantastic. But men can get involved, and they have been. We just need them to be more active with it, as same with just some women as well. But I don't want to think anyone to think that this is a total male bashing session, because there are plenty of men out there who are trying to be part of the solution, and are willing to put real muscle behind it and real energy. And we really need to continue to thank them for that.
We have t-shirts at YWCA that read "Real Men Heart YWCA." And I think men who care about the concept of empowering women and girls have joy in this opportunity that Cynthia just mentioned, to do something differently than might have been done 25 years ago. and to really support a woman or a woman of color in their journey, in their career journey. That's wonderful. I think, for those of us like Arisa and Cynthia and I, who probably feel like we have a pretty great network and a pretty awesome people in our network and social capital that we can sometimes almost take for granted. There's this recognition that not everybody has that. And how do you help them build that network? And at YWCA, we have 2 housing programs. One of them is Women in Transition. And something we started doing in an informal way a few years ago was helping women who were looking for the next rung on the ladder to partner with someone that already knew and loved the YWCA, that was already connected with us, who had either done that or was further along in their career. And that turned out to be a really beautiful experiment, so that a woman who was a CNA at an assisted living center who had dreams of working in a leadership role on a memory care unit could be partnered with a woman who'd been in that field for many years, who knew us, loved us, and thought what we did was great. And they were able to talk about things that I would not be able to be helpful with. I think we often think that people follow a very linear path, and sometimes it's very liberating to hear that their path was atypical, or that they took a very circuitous path to get to where they were. And that is empowering to hear if you're the mentee or the one being sponsored, that there's lots of ways to get to your goal, and how wonderful it is to add people into your circle who can help you in their own unique ways to pursue that goal.
And in terms of your question, Arisa, and thank you, Kirsten, for being so eloquent on sharing some of the programs that you guys are doing to make a difference. And I would also add that when we're talking about solutions, and I talked earlier about having to step off of that train for a variety of reasons and having a hard time getting back on, we don't have very good safety nets for people who step off the train, right? So the whole idea of paid leave, whether it be for elder care or child care, sick leave. This just the concept of being able to have sick leave, talk to our hourly workers, they'll tell you they don't even know what that means. But the concept of being able to have sick leave and then to get paid for it is something that's also helpful. So there are some things that we need to continue to try to put in place from a legislative perspective that would be very helpful for women as they go through life's journey and deal with these issues around child care and elder care and sickness, et cetera. The other thing in my work with financial literacy, when I talk to women, it's so interesting because I tell them, I said, look, you're earning less than your male counterparts. And we've talked about some of the reasons why. You're likely going to outlive many of the men in your family. And you may have healthcare issues yourself along the way, plus having to deal with elder care and child care, et cetera. So your financial needs are in some cases greater than men.
Right.
Yet, when you look at what they're doing in terms of preparing for the future, the money is sitting in a savings account, or it's under a mattress, or it's frozen in the refrigerator somewhere. And those types of tactics will not get them the financial boost that they're going to need to deal with some of these issues down the road. So that's when we talk about solutions. I think it's very important that we need to educate our women, young and old, about the need for them to take charge of their financial future. And I tell people, if you can grocery shop, you can invest in the market, right? You're trying to buy low and sell high. If you know how to go find a sale somewhere, you know how to go invest in the market. So, but getting women comfortable with that concept and helping them understand it's important to make the money that you do have work for you. Otherwise, your money is not going to outlast you. It's going to be the reverse. And you're going to see somebody who's 80 years old trying to get an hourly job to help make ends meet. So those are solutions that I would offer as well.
Thank you so much. I want to get a closing comment, but before we do that, we've got Oh gosh, time has flown by. I knew it would. We do have a survey for this workshop on economic equity and the pay gap. And so we encourage all of our listeners and viewers to complete the survey. You have until the end of the summit to complete the survey. But with that, if I could get a closing comment or word from both of you, and let me say thank you so much for your contribution to this panel. This has been so insightful and so educational.
Arisa, thank you so much. I would end with a plug for engaging by using your civic voice. And I would encourage people to go to our national website, ywca.org, so that you can learn, for example, about the legislation that Cynthia just mentioned, the Family Act for paid family leave, or the Paycheck Fairness Act, so that you can educate yourself about things that you can do as an individual. And then I also think, that's a macro level, as Cynthia said. The micro level is what can you do in your own sphere? What young person can you reach to encourage them to start putting what they can into their 401k or into their 403b at precisely the time that they think they don't have enough money to do that because they're at the beginning of their career. But with the magic of compound interest, how important it is for them to start when they're 24, 25 years old. So there's a whole array of, who do I help now in my sphere, and how do I cast that net more broadly by advocating for legislation that impacts women that I'll never ever meet. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So much, all. And I would say, I had mentioned earlier that I view this gap really as a chasm, and it reminded me a lot of the Grand Canyon. So when I went to the Grand Canyon for the first time, I thought it was going to be like a bathtub. I thought I could just drive around it or walk around it, peer down into it and see the bottom, and be like, oh yeah, this is impressive, and kind of keep going. And then when you get there, you realize it's not a bathtub. It's something far exceeding that. You can't see the other end of it, nor can you just stand on the edge and peer down into it. But you can navigate your way through. There are others who have gone before. This thing has been traversed for centuries. There are some well-trodden trails and some new ones. And if you find a guide or multiple guides, they can help lead you through that treacherous terrain. While we were there, unfortunately, a woman perished. She decided to take a less trod path and was not well equipped with the appropriate provisions. And so unfortunately, in her situation, she did not make it. And then the Grand Canyon has a number of people who don't make it every year. They don't have the right guides. They don't even know they need certain equipment. They don't understand the social environment. So taking it back to our discussion, think about yourself and your lives. Try to think about maybe who can I grab hold of, who can help me navigate? What are things that I can do so that I'm better prepared to cross something as broad and as deep as a Grand Canyon in terms of pay equity? And then just go do it. And your guide may or may not look like you. Could be older, could be younger, different race. It really doesn't matter. If they're willing to impart knowledge, grab hold of it. And then for those who have the knowledge, share it. Speak loud and speak often, because you never know who might be listening and be able to benefit from it. So that's what I'll share.
Invest in yourself, know your worth, find your guides, and stay connected. Thank you so much for being a part of our panel. Thank you for listening and participating in the chat. Remember to fill out the survey, and remember to connect with me, with Cynthia, with Kirsten, and with people you meet throughout the day. Thank you very much, and I look forward to connecting with you for the rest of the summit.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.